Infrastructure, no bumps in the road. It needs to be simple. Keep it simple. It is very, very disturbing when I hear the millionaire or billionaire word. And I've told them to stop it, knock it off.
I don't even care about those guys. It really just honestly doesn't matter. Have you heard about the SJW nonsense on the? I don't even care about those guys. It really just honestly doesn't matter. Have you heard about the SJW nonsense on the?
And maybe we need a solution to it that risks the imagination of a new kind of possibility.
Couldn't let anything go by. I had to get revenge.
The human brain. There is nothing in this universe that even begins to compare with the human brain and what it is capable of. Billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard. I could take the oldest person here, make a little hole right here on the side of the head, and put some depth electrodes into their hippocampus and stimulate, and they would be able to recite back to you verbatim a book they read 60 years ago. It's all there. It doesn't go away. You just have to learn how to recall it. But that's what your brain is capable of. It can process more than 2 million bits of information per second. You can't overload it. Have you ever heard people say, don't do all that, you'll overload your brain? You can't overload the human brain. If you learned one new fact every second, it would take you more than 3 million years to challenge the capacity of your brain. Can't be done. So we need to concentrate a little less on what we can't do and a little more on what we can do. After all, this is America. This used to be known as the can-do society. Not the what can you do for me society, but the can-do society.
I think
After 2 years of street protests, strikes, community meetings, and pressure on lawmakers, the Brazilian unions defeated illegitimate President Michel Temer's pension reform proposal. Now Finance Minister Paulo Guedes has a new proposal which will cut minimum benefits in half and require 40 years of contribution. In São Bernardo, an industrial suburb of São Paulo, ABC Metal Workers Union President Wagner Santana explains what these reforms would mean for Brazilian workers.
The Brazilian worker makes pension contributions on average 9 months per year. It would take 53 years for them to make 40 effective years of contributions, which removes the possibility of people to retire.
In front of an auto plant in São Bernardo, workers express their worries about the new proposal and talk about what needs to be done to stop it.
If this goes through, unfortunately, it would lead to discrimination against the elderly.
If we are going to unite in the struggle against this, we have to go beyond the factories and bring this debate to society so that everyone can get involved in the important fight against these reforms.
Back in the Metallurgical Workers Union headquarters, where Lula began his career, Wagner Santana explains how Brazilian unions and social movements plan to fight these reforms.
We are holding a General Assembly of the working class on February 20th, here in Sao Paulo, and from there, if necessary, we will call a general strike and paralyze the factories against the pension reforms. We will do it.
Brian Mir, Telesur, São Bernardo.
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. We're broadcasting live steps. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Chief economist David Griscom.
How's it going?
Everybody really sinking into their core brand propositions. Super producer David Slavic. He's on the digitosphere in the ever-expanding, ever-growing, ever-global TMBS universe. On this week's program, the great Mark Blyth. He's a professor of political economy at Brown University. You know him from his books and lectures on austerity, populism, why the global neoliberal consensus has been such a profound disservice to so many. We're talking about the Green New Deal, why Trump can't run an economic populism scam as he runs for re-election, and how to read the Yellow Vest movement in France, all that and more with Mark Blyth. Plus, Shoutout strikes in Denver and student solidarity by doing exactly what all students are supposed to do, which is cut class. My great regret of not spending more time in public schools was that I didn't get to be truant more often.
I took full advantage.
Indeed. And speaking of which, Kamala Harris. We have more to say about her. She goes on the Breakfast Club and makes some super charming comments about weed, but her record is far from that. Plus, it's also just kind of sort of hacky comedic material. We'll get to that. Griscom Economic Minute. Congress gears up for new votes to cut off funding for the Saudi Emirati war on Yemen. In the post-game, we're going to break down how exactly to read the Ilhan Omar controversy and why there needs to be complete solidarity with her, a completely different conversation on Israel, Palestine, democracy across the Middle East, and also why we do need to transcend this outrage culture game. It's not strategic. Plus, Amy Klobuchar and her defenders go in the gulag. We'll explain why. And Mexico returns to its traditional foreign policy roots by opposing a coup in Venezuela. All of that and much, much more in the post game. But first, we got to talk about what's happening in Brazil. It's been several months now, a couple of months, since Jair Bolsonaro, Brazil's fascist president, has taken office with the backing of the U.S. corporate sector, of the Wall Street Journal, and of our government, in fact, and the Canadian government. And he's gone about very aggressively doing what he promised to do in both regards. Let me explain what I mean by that. So a lot of the attention to Bolsonaro has been rightly focused on his war against the poor, his war on Afro-Brazilians, his war against the LGBTQ community. This is very real. We already saw a openly gay congressperson fleeing the country as an example. This, and not even to mention the plans for the Amazon and the repression of indigenous people, and the really, in fact, genocidal policies if they are carried out in the Amazon. But there's also why the U.S. corporate sector was so enthusiastic about him, which has to do with, well, in fact, the Amazon, but also things like eliminating Brazil's pension system. The Bolsonaro government is trying to privatize the Brazilian pension program and move it into the Chilean model. This makes a lot of sense because the man overseeing this program, this attempt to gut Brazil's pension system, actually, in fact, trained and worked in Pinochet's Chile. In Chile, they have a private pension model, which is their Social Security equivalent, and funds are often missing or unable to be provided to pensioners. The proposed changes in Brazil would cut benefits for almost half of existing pensions, and new requirements would mean that most Brazilian workers would need to pay into the pension program for at least 40 years to receive benefits. And basically what had happened is that under the Michel Temer government, which took power after the coup that removed Dilma Rousseff from power, they immediately began implementing austerity and eliminating the gains of the Workers' Party government. Now, the workers organized against Temer's version of pension reform, and now under Bolsonaro, it's even more aggressive and more vicious. So when you sort of combine the strategy of primitive accumulation in the pension system and in the Amazon, and then you connect it with this really punitive, vicious agenda with policing, you can also see a through line through the corruption scandal emerging around the Bolsonaro family. And of course, all of this corruption rhetoric has always been nonsense to begin with, and there's no doubt that generic anti-corruption is the handmaiden of global fascism. So there's corruption structurally. And in Brazil, the structural corruption as manifested with Bolsonaro doesn't have side benefits that benefit workers or different types of bottom-up coalitions. It's a pure corruption of the upper classes attempting to destroy safety nets, workers' rights, and take away things like literally the living system of the Amazon. And then there's also much more robust and real potential money laundering scandals that implicate the Bolsonaro family. In the last several weeks, there have been stories that connect Bolsonaro's son, who's also a politician, to the militia named the Office of Crime. This is the militia that's suspected of assassinating city councilwoman and activist Marielle Franco. We're going to play a brief clip here of activists protesting after her assassination this last spring.
Despite the music and dancing, this is not a happy occasion. Protesters rally in the streets of Sao Paulo to mourn the murder of a prominent politician, once described as a tireless social warrior. The biggest marches were in her hometown of Rio de Janeiro, where tens of thousands of Brazilians gathered outside the city's council. This is the woman whose killing has provoked such outrage, Marielle Franco. The 38-year-old councillor has become a voice for gay and black rights, as well as fighting against police violence in poor areas of the city. Police officials say she was deliberately targeted. Franco was shot 4 times in the head, and her driver was also killed. Her assistant, who was sitting in the back, survived.
Flavio Bolsonaro, Jair Bolsonaro's son, had the mother and wife of the former police captain who is suspected of leading this gang or being in the prime leadership of this gang. He had both this person's mother and wife on his direct payroll, and there's also a lot of evidence of money laundering in the form of direct deposits into Flavio Bolsonaro's accounts, right? And this whole militia system, you saw that kind of weird name, the Office of Crime, goes back to the fact that this militia culture and a lot of these paramilitaries in Brazilian cities actually arise out of special Brazilian police units that went into favelas and other high crime areas to bring down the rate of violence, and then essentially kind of turn themselves into local mafias and corruption rackets. That's what Marielle was working against as a city councilor, both the kind of abuses of the police in general. Brazil has sky-high rates of police killings, and then also these specific cartels, which is why she was targeted. And this is, of course, in conjunction with the removal of the Workers' Party from power through a judicial process that was fundamentally corrupt and dishonest. And of course, as I always say, the imprisonment of Lula da Silva, who is leading in all polls on the flimsiest of evidence. He's in jail for secondhand testimony, and this family is still operating in control of the country with almost certain direct cash transfers in accounts that we see today without even a full police or legal investigation. Police murders and targeting of favelas have been skyrocketing in the last couple of weeks. Last Friday, an operation by the Brazilian military ended with the death of 13 people in a favela in Rio de Janeiro. The Brazilian newspaper Folha reported that a large portion of the dead were killed after they had surrendered in a prejudicial summary execution. And it was reported that the police were laughing and promised it would be more next time. Rio's new Bolsonaro-affiliated governor said security forces are now authorized to shoot and kill suspects. So when you look at that, and also the other thread I want to bring in here, and I don't know if he's connected to this, but Rudy Giuliani ran a consulting service across Latin America and the Caribbean when he left the mayor, when he ended his reign as mayor of New York City, where he actually advised police departments on tactics that, of course, he used to terrorize people in New York City in already very violent, very class-stratified areas. So that's an update on what's happening in Brazil. And also these themes, again, as always, are global. We saw last week with the conversation of global Palestine, this notion that we're entering into a phase of capitalism where there's a lot more kind of security force coercion of marginalized and even more and more broad, just basic sort of broad swaths of the population. Brazil is the testing ground now for that too. First, it was the generic anti-corruption politics weaponized to benefit the far right and fascists and destroy an important and legitimate social democratic party and the movements that sort of undergird it, which is the Workers' Party. Then there was using the judicial process to create a political prisoner in Lula, remove a government from power, and now we see this kind of formal fusion in a way that's much more overt in Brazil, but obviously exists in the United States between Trump and the business class, of this overtly far-right authoritarian leadership, which might be embarrassing to some people because it's so crude and so over the top, but actually really represents those interests in full. So that's what's happening in Brazil. We will continue, and as I've said before, there's conversations ongoing about how to do more with regards to not only Brazil in general, and of course also the political imprisonment of Lula specifically as well, and also accountability for the assassination of Marielle. Let's do this real quick. We got to get to the shout out.
To the shout out. Creepy.
I think you should just basically rap over this to the extent you can.
Yeah,
David. At least, David, go. Look, you're a big man, always trying to step up, talk shit about Richard Wolff, and you can't get on this beat. Yeah, long horns.
This beat. You gotta listen to it.
Kobe meme.
I wish our video editing software allowed us to do like a shake effect, like the entire, like it was a Harlem Shake style breakdown happening while that's playing.
All right, you have our marching orders video department.
Come on, Wirecast.
Come on. Get better. Denver teachers are on strike. They've been on strike for a couple of days. They're back at the negotiating table. I've been noticing there have been a bunch of nerds like the New York Post who are whining about kids ditching class in solidarity with their teachers. And I just want to say, first of all, kids should be trying to ditch class, period. That's what they're supposed to do. And secondly, they're ditching class for the right cause. And they're doing more for their teachers than certainly anybody writing any of these whiny, mediocre tweets about it have ever done. So let's watch these kids showing up for their teachers. And this is what it's going to look like. You know, political change isn't always so orderly, uptight people. Sometimes it's a little rowdy. These kids get it.
Way more than people in DC.
Well, I mean, more so than people, yeah, particularly DC. I would almost give DC like a handicap. You know, It's like if you're from DC, it's like, all right, just take a couple of. You could start a few yards ahead. Shout out to those kids. Shout out to the striking teachers in Denver. Shout out to the flight attendants and everybody else who've made it clear that there's not even going to be a wait time if there's any more bullshit on another government shutdown for this white nationalist scam. All right, we're going to call Mark Blyth in just a minute. But first, you know what time it is. It's time to become a patron of the Michael Brooks Show. Griscom, since you couldn't rap over Alex Jones and he copped out in a very sort of lawyerly way, do the pitch. And you're, by the way, just to be blunt, you're pretty good at the pitches. When I asked Matt, he's like, "Oh, it's good. It's a good show. It's history."
No, I mean,
you know what it is.
You know what it is. Actually, it's pretty good, Matt.
This is a good time to join. I mean, we're pretty close to getting 2,000 patrons.
We are
which
close.
has been a goal of ours for a while. We're all very excited for it. But you know what? You get a lot. We've been covering so much. We've been going through all of the history of the left with our illicit histories.
That's right.
We got our theory reading groups, plenty of extra bonus content. I mean, you're really getting like 3-to-1 content. And then, of course, don't forget the post game where we're always hanging out after the show, take your calls and IMs. And you know what? It's a really wonderful community, the Patreon community. We have a humming Discord. People are wonderful. It was really wonderful meeting everyone in that Discord, by the way.
Yes, it was. At the live show. That was a pleasure. We had that was a great success. Patreon.com/TMBS. We're working on it. There is some type of weird nonsense with YouTube. But we're apparently under review again as we continue to get more and more subscribers. Latest video that just went up is a commentary breakdown of me debating an absolute lunatic on Israeli cable television. It's called Michael Brooks Debates a Mayo Brain on cable TV. Check it out. And help sustain everything we do at patreon.com/TMBS. For patrons, you got an email about an hour before the show started, and this isn't broadly available yet, but we'll be getting information out in the next couple of days. But April 20th, LA, that's the second TMBS live show. Joining us are Waz, Big Waz, Wozni Lambre from Count the Dings, my co-host on Woke Bros, which you can find at the Bomb feed, Black Opinions Matter on iTunes. That's a great show.
Good Northam ep.
Yes. I'm glad I was actually going to tell you to listen to that one. That was a really good one. Waz and I are covering a lot on that show. And I believe in everything Waz and I do, obviously. So he's going to be there. Incredibly excited about that. The great, the brilliant, the relentlessly talented Anna Kasparian, co-host of The Young Turks, is going to be there. And the absolutely amazing, multimedia talented former Fusion host. He's working on a bunch of stuff that you want to learn more about. He hasn't been on this show in actually too long of a period of time. And when he comes back on, I will definitely be wearing a suit. Nando Vila is going to round out the lineup. So that's going to be a monster show. If you're a patron, you got the email with your promo code so you can get your tickets right out of the gate. I saw some notifications on the Discord. Some people have already got their tickets. So obviously this one's going to be going fast. And I will be posting and letting you know about how to join us there in the next couple of days. We'll see you soon. We're going to take a brief break and we'll be right back with Mark Blyth.
And every human being, regardless of their ethnicity or their background, they have a brain. The human brain There is nothing in this universe that even begins to compare with the human brain and what it is capable of. Billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard. I could take the oldest person here, make a little hole right here on the side of the head, and put some depth electrodes into their hippocampus and stimulate, and they would be able to recite back to you verbatim a book they read 60 years ago. It's all there. It doesn't go away. You just have to learn how to recall it. But that's what your brain is capable. It can process more than 2 million bits of information per second. You can't overload it. Have you ever heard people say, don't do all that, you'll overload your brain? You can't overload the human brain. If you learned one new fact every second, it would take you more than 3 million years to challenge the capacity of your brain. Can't be done. So we need to concentrate a little less on what we can't do and a little more on what we can do. After all, this is America. This used to be known as the can-do society. Not the what can you do for me society, but the can-do society.
Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Professor Blyth requested Ben Carson's sound drops before he came on. Joining us now, and I have this written down, I have this just came in over the telex machine, is Professor Mark Blyth. He is the William Rhodes 57 Professor of International Political Economy.
No, just economics.
International Economics at Brown University. All right, I was 90% there.
You are.
Apologies.
Accepted.
Mark, this is always so much fun. Thanks so much for returning. I want to start by just going pretty big. You've been talking for a while both about the destructive myth of austerity. Actually, could you do that just a little bit? I know this is already in the rearview mirror, but from the perspective of
don't worry, it's coming again.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, the subtitle of the book was, the history of a dangerous idea. And the definition in the book of a dangerous idea is one that's immune to empirical refutation. Right. So that pretty much sums it up. So basically, at some point soon, next time there's a financial crisis, probably leverage loans or something like that will tip over a bank, and then we'll all be like, what are we going to do? And then someone will say, well, we need to tighten our belts. And someone will say, well, if you think about it, a family that spends too much, they have to rein in their expenditure, and that's what the government has to do too. And then I have to come out and go, all right, how many families do you know get to bring people into the family and tax them for 5 or 6 generations? None. How many families get to issue their own currency? Particularly if you're the United States and it's the global reserve currency, that's pretty important. None. Intergenerational taxation, check, got that one. Oh, bond market. Do you get to do debt through your children? No, you don't. So in other words, a family and a household and a state, particularly the United States, is nothing like each other, right? Yeah, pretty much. Why do you keep saying it is? Because I'm a billionaire and I don't want to pay any taxes.
That's the politics of it, and for sure. Why is it? What struck me when I read your book, and I'd like you to comment on again, is also just this. It actually does reveal the power of language too, because it's this incredible. In the family analogy, in analogies like, well, I've been partying a lot, and I'm drinking a little too much. I've got to get myself on a regimen. I got to take a run. I got to drink more water, as if the economy is the analog of that in terms of, cut down the spending, cut down the waste, get healthy. And then, of course,
but here's the fundamental thing. Look, that may be true, particularly if you're you and you live in Brooklyn and you're half my age. Yes. Then, yeah, you should drink less, and you should probably go for a run every now and again.
Well, I do run, and as for the rest of it, mind your business, Mark.
Well, I'm just simply saying it's true in your case because you're a unique individual. Your consumption has nothing to do with anybody else's, right? Unless you lash out and get violent when you're drunk, right? Then there's externalities. But it doesn't work with government budgets for the simple reason that if the private sector is saving, then by definition, if the government sector saves as well, all that happens is the economy shrinks. Now, we did an experiment on this in real time. It was called Greece. Right? And what we said to Greece was, well, we know that your bond market's under pressure, so your government has to cut spending. And given the government spending in Greece was pretty important when you did that, and there was also a big recession elsewhere in Europe, it meant that the private sector went, oh, hang on a minute, I'm not going to spend any money now, I better save too. And what happened was Greek GDP, gross domestic product, fell by 25%. And they ended up with, I think, 40% more debt than when they started. And that was without issuing any new debt. The denominator basically shrunk and the numerator exploded. So yeah, it just doesn't work. There's no way you can do that, right? Basically, you can look after yourself or not. Your family can be budgetarily thrifty or not. It has nothing to do with anyone else. Government's very different.
Well, how do we debunk, as it comes back, the debt myth, which is well, you say all that, but the debt is coming.
Well, the debt is coming, but all right, I'll give you an example of this, right? So every year I give a talk to a branch of the United States military. And without going into details, they're a nice bunch of folks. But anyway, I give them I walk in and I say, ladies and gentlemen, the national debt is a crisis. And the national debt is the same as gross domestic product. It's $17 trillion. It's a disgrace. How can we possibly be a world-leading country that affords the things that you guys need in the military? So we need to get rid of this. Who agrees with me? And every hand goes up. I was like, great, okay, that's great. So if you had the power at the stroke of a pen to reduce the national debt by 50%, would you do it? Every single hand goes up. These are not foolish people. And then I say, congratulations, ladies and gentlemen, you just destroyed half of national savings. Because the public debt is the national savings. They're called bonds, savings bonds. And people buy them because they're safe, so-called liquid assets. So if you were to destroy the national debt, you would wipe out half of national savings. What else would that go into? Would it go into houses? Would it go into gold? Would it hopefully go into investment? We simply don't know. But the fact is it's in debt because people like it, and one person's debt is another person's asset. And we completely wipe that out of the collective memory.
How do these cliches form? I mean, we understand that the reason why billionaires and oligarchs feed them because they want to rob the public and not pay their share. But how in general, because even just the debt thing, and I'm not questioning the intelligence of your military friends at all. It's just that there's so many.
They've got guns.
Right. Well, that was what I was thinking. I just didn't want to spell it out. But no, I mean, obviously they're brilliant guys. They do great jobs, and you should see them. I'm surprised you didn't describe it like Trump, where you said, I went in and they looked like Tom Cruise, except better.
Well, no, I was actually by far the most handsome person in the room, but that's an entirely different story.
I believe that. I have a very high standard for my guests, so there's no doubt about that.
What was your point?
My point was my point was a decent riff, but my point was how did these cliches? It's a very easy cliche to say. You can go in most rooms in America and say the deficit is a crisis, or for that matter, I'm a fiscal conservative but a social liberal. These things that don't actually even mean anything, and to the extent they do.
The contemporary equivalent of that is PAYGO.
Exactly. Explain that.
Right.
How did these things start? What is the cliche?
Well, it becomes a kind of self-reinforcing circle. So, I mean, when you give up on the notion that there is such a thing as a public good, which became essentially very contested in the 1960s for lots of different reasons, and into the 70s and the inflationary crisis. Then you get the whole narrative that really catches hold of state bad, market good, Reagan walking out and saying the most dangerous thing anyone can say is I'm from the government and I'm here to help. Once you demonize the production of public goods and the agencies that do that, then it's very hard to make a kind of positive case for these institutions. These institutions run on taxes. People don't want to pay taxes because they've been told all these things are a waste of time. You shouldn't be paying taxes. Taxes is theft, Grover Norquist, all this nonsense, right? So basically you build up through the network of funding of billionaires, through think tanks, political parties, etc., this entire narrative of state failure and waste and so on and so forth. And then what do Democrats do everywhere? They go, yeah, kind of, I guess you're right. Whoa. That's terrible. Well, you know what? We'll be even more fiscally conservative than you. And yeah, we'll be even, yeah, exactly. So they completely lost the rationale and the arguments that they used to make for why that's just nonsense and should be called out as nonsense. One of the things that I love about the current moment is the fact that you've got some young Democrats in the party, without mentioning any obvious names, who are not afraid to basically say, no, this is nonsense. And we need to recognize it as nonsense. And then they get hell from the right-wing media, but then they just go, no, it doesn't matter how loud you shout it. At the end of the day, this is illogical rubbish. Stop saying it. And that's great.
Yeah, and that's a great segue to, in a minute, getting to the Green New Deal, because I can actually hear some of what even 6 months ago in one of our conversations, you were talking about just the idea of, first, of course, having this critique of injustice, but actually generating a positive, forward-looking, human, flourishing vision of economics. But before we get there, can you also re-review the history of the structure of how we got there in terms of center-left parties in the United States and Europe in particular, which is the kind of changing class composition of those parties, and the shift from activist organizing bases to sort of political consultant PR campaigns?
All right, so for anybody who's listening, watching, or otherwise consuming, there's a fabulous book you should get from Harvard University Press. It's from a sociologist by the name of Stephanie Mudge. And I forget the exact title. It's something along the line. I should remember because I blurred the book. But it's called Reforming the Left or something like this. I forget exactly what it is. But anyway, it's like Sweden, the United Kingdom, the United States does all the great cases. And they all have this in common. And this is basically the story. In the 1970s, parties of the left still had real grassroots organizations. And they were connected to trade unions. And trade unions did crazy stuff like have classes for people where they would explain how the economy works and what's going on and all this sort of stuff, even in the United States. Not as quite as much as places like Sweden or Germany, but they did. And therefore, there was this kind of organic connection. In the 70s, with the inflationary crisis of the 70s and the first globalization shock, which is basically Japan and South Korea taking, in some sense, I don't want to sound like Trump, but I'm trying to be quick here. Basically, those industries migrated to East Asia, pushing us on top of the flight of industrial capital that you had trying to go to right-to-work states, for example, from Wisconsin to Texas and places like this. And you get that kind of first hollowing out of the Democratic coalition. Now, what is the lesson that the Democrats and New Labour in Britain, as it becomes, and the SPD in Germany take, is, right, we're going to resist this. So the first wave is resistance, and that just fails. Because in a sense, these parties are the establishment, and they've been seen to fail in some sense. So along comes this discredited right-wing old-time religion philosophy, Reagan, Thatcher, the rest of it. And what it does is it kind of reboots the system. And the way that the parties respond on the left is they hire technocrats. As Professor Mudge puts it, if I get it correctly, basically they find economists who are friendly to finance, strategists who will tell you how to win, technocrats will tell you what works and what doesn't and what policies you can choose. And you create this kind of technocratic infrastructure that only talks about policy rather than politics. Then along comes the second globalization shock for the United States. That's basically NAFTA. And then the third one, the China shock. And by that point, boom, that traditional Democratic constituency has been completely left at the same time as the Democrats have made this pivot towards basically embracing Wall Street and the sort of the Reuben Summers version of the world, which is exactly what they seem to be hurt by. So then along comes Trump and says, you guys got screwed by Wall Street in China. And, you know, is it any surprise it has massive resonance?
Yeah, right. And then we have that like very specific, like there's this book that I don't really recommend anybody read, to be honest, though he's a smart guy and has played a big role for better in some ways and many ways for worse in kind of modern center-left politics. But Stanley Greenberg has this book of working with 5 different candidates, from Ehud Barak to Nelson Mandela to Bill Clinton to Tony Blair to Sanchez Goni de la Sada in Bolivia. And one of the things that's just amazing about it, though, is that this package of advice that almost always has to do with alienating traditional left constituencies, essentially,
right,
as the sort of like prime brand package of what in the 90s was the most prominent Democratic consulting firm. I think now the consulting firms are a little bit more kind of distributed, but the ones that are getting hired by the DNC are still kind of peddling this stuff. And
it was an incredible move at the time, right? I mean, you think about the point of view of these firms, right? Even let's assume that their hearts are in their bodies, if not in the right place.
Sure.
Then what is it they're trying to do? They're trying to save the Democratic Party.
Yep.
So what do you need in this new environment of like everything's television? And you don't need members coming to meetings and complaining about stuff. You need donations. And there's this giant thing over there that's just been let loose over the past 10 years called Wall Street. And it turns out some of them are vaguely progressive. Well, why not just go there? You don't have to deal with like 40 people. You know, I remember my favorite line from Tony Blair was something along the lines of, it's a paraphrase, but he felt much better in a private jet than he did talking to trade unionists. And that kind of sums up that entire class.
That sums it up perfectly. And yeah, I mean, if the rumors about Tony Blair and Rupert Murdoch's wife are true, that's cool. But besides that,
can't possibly comment on those things.
I know. That was side comment, Professor Blyth. You're not implicated by it at all. What do you think of the Green New Deal?
I think it's awesome. I really do. And I'm fully behind it. I don't know if I'm fully behind it in this form. If you look through the proposal, it's a little bit of sort of a nudge and a wink to everyone. So we're also going to have universal healthcare, and we should also build shit tons of public housing. I mean, yeah, I agree with all those things. But let's just think about decarbonization, right? So last year we had 2 reports out with the world scientific community. And for anybody there who's still a climate skeptic, just do this experiment in your head, or please tell this to everybody else who you meet who's like, I'm not sure about this, right? Who is the most at stake here? You've got a bunch of people who are some of the most talented and mathematically gifted people in the world. And that means if they basically were just venal actors, they could be on Wall Street, they could be working in tech firms, they could be rubbing themselves in money with the skills they've got. Instead of which they've decided to do this thing that's kind of politically insensitive and work in universities and compete for an ever-diminishing pool of grant money and spend your summers in Antarctica digging shit out of rock, right? That's the people who are doing the enormous global conspiracy to fool us all. On the other hand, you have a half a dozen PR firms and about 20 different institutes, which have been set up wholly by fossil fuel money with basically C-rate people to talk a lot of crap, right? That's it. That's the divide. So unless you really think that's actually, well, there's 2 sides to every argument, no, stop. It's real, right? Now, with that as preamble, last year we had 2 reports that basically say we've got, depending on you want to be serious or not, 12 to 15 years to seriously do something about decarbonization. Because if we don't, we die as a species. That's what they were saying. And it was like, well, you know, it's a little bit alarmist, whatever. Well, then we got the insect apocalypse data that we've destroyed 70% of the biomass of insect life in some parts of the world, which is bloody alarming, because they are the bottom of the pyramid of everything. And if they go, everything collapses, right? So we really are in the middle. It's incredible to think this way, because I have, you know, a young family, and I don't want to think about this stuff. I don't want it to be true, but it's grotesquely irresponsible to pretend otherwise, that we face an enormous crisis. Now, here's the thing. No one's pointing a gun at you. Aliens aren't landing. Nobody's shooting up your house, so it doesn't seem like a crisis. But by God, it's the biggest one we've ever faced. So anything that brings that to the agenda is good. Second thing, the direct link that is made with inequality. If you do this right, you can also, through public investment, create a more fair economy and do a ton of work on inequality as well. And why that's particularly resonant for me is because I'm going to spend next year, oddly enough, writing a book which I plan to write, which is precisely about the link between inequality, climate, and solving climate change, and how the 2 of them can go together. So as far as I'm concerned, sign me up, right? Let's not try and worry about pleasing every constituency. Just achieving decarbonization over a 10 to 15 year period, or getting it down to like a reasonable level, renewing the power grid, building the infrastructure you need, changing the buildings, just simply changing the buildings to be more or less carbon neutral. That's one of the most largest scale efforts of investment we could make as a society. It's up there with the space race. It's probably bigger. So, let's not try and fight every battle at once, but let's realize how serious this is and let's get serious about it.
I do think I like the frame that Kate Aronoff has put forward of actually framing it in terms of the 5 freedoms, building off of FDR's 4 freedoms. And I think it does. I mean, obviously the specifics of it will get ironed out in legislation, but I like the idea of actually really explicitly synthesizing decarbonization with these broader efforts that we need to do in terms of inequality and updating our basic social infrastructure in a way that I love. Your work has always synthesized that so well. So I'm really excited about the book. I want to go to Trump for a bit, and just a brief preamble. So I think there's the dynamic that you identified with Trump, which is definitely true to some extent, and particularly in the most geographically important areas, namely the states in the industrial Midwest that he was able to flip through a combination of Democratic failure and specifically Clinton campaign failure and his kind of, his economic populism scam, I would call it.
And a fair amount of massive dog whistling as
well, right. That was the thing. Right. Because then I would say that, right, I would think a vast majority of it is in fact, just right-wing white identity politics and xenophobia. And this is interesting, though, because now that he's in office, the dual tracks are a lot harder to pull off, the racism and the xenophobia is very alive and very well and actively campaigning on. But I want to just read you the headline of a piece by Brianna Joy Gray, who's one of our regulars, and she wrote for The Intercept called "Trump's State of the Union Address Reveals His Growing Anxiety About Encroaching Left-Wing Populism." And I'm just curious your take on that, because of these newer Democrats and obviously Bernie that you're talking about, and because he's in office and he's not going to actually offend the oligarchs that fund the Republican Party, that opportunity to sort of play that scam of economic populism seems like it's diminishing for him.
I'm not sure that's the case. Number one, look at the guy's numbers, right? I mean, if any other president behaved the way that this guy did, he would be down in 20% by now. And let's remember that, Bush, who had a strong coalition behind him, not initially, but he built it up through the Iraq War and different colored alerts and basically scaring the bejesus out of people for a while. By the time that he left office, he was down to like around 30%. Now, Trump's numbers, depending on the poll you look at, I don't think they've dropped below 34, and sometimes they're popping up still at around 40. So people are buying something. Now, what is it? The great thing about Trump, and I did a podcast interview with Adam Tooze, the historian at Columbia, a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things he said is brilliant. He just said, look, the man's fantastic at pivoting. And what he did in his campaign and what he continues to do is to turn to the Midwest and say, I'm standing up on China. Who else is doing that? And if you bought the narrative that the bilateral trade balance really is meaningful, and these are the people who wiped you out, and yes, the China shock hurt, but so did NAFTA. And actually, the biggest one was actually automation plus the right to work move from the 60s through the 70s, from north to south states. If you basically buy China as a problem, this guy's being tough on China. If you say, well, I'm the guy that's sticking up for you because nobody else is, well, what exactly are the Democrats doing that are sort of equivalent noise? And then from there, and then infrastructure. I always want to do infrastructure, but I can't get anything done because the Democrats won't work with me because they won't work on border security, as it's called. So then he seamlessly pivots and goes to constituencies which are dog whistling, which is essentially immigration, racism, etc., all in one nice big package. Never mentioning the fact that there really is no border crisis, that 2,000 people kipping up at the border from a failed state with a population of 330 million isn't even, isn't the rounding error of a rounding error, but instead it's a national crisis. Of course, this is massively engineered in like the ugly side of nativist populism, but he seamlessly pivots both. And that's what makes it so powerful, and that's what makes it so dangerous. So I don't think that's run out of steam. I think it's actually just there. And basically, no one has really tested a counter narrative or counter strategy at an individual level. That's why going forward, the competition amongst Democrats to kind of get the crown to challenge him is going to be so important, because you're going to have to be able to pivot in a much better way that counters those two moves.
I agree 100% with the second part. I think the first part, I mean, I don't know. To me, his poll numbers now are, and I think maybe even relative to Bush, we might even be slightly more polarized at this point. And
it's certainly polarized. It's
but I think his base, I mean, that number is the Republican Party. And I think that the Republican Party is the party. It's a fusion of oligarchy and white identity politics. And frankly, and I think that the people that voted for him out of desperation and because of Democratic total failure, I don't know if they will show up for Democrats, but I don't think they'll show up for him. I think it would be more likely that those voters would just stay home. But we'll see.
That's yeah. At this point, that's totally plausible. We simply don't know, right? My bet, however, is that the distaste in the mouth of many people for what the Democrats became is actually still very, very palpable.
Oh,
and
definitely.
It's going to take someone to really change that impression to make that work.
No, they need to elect somebody. They need to nominate. I mean, look, I think on one hand,
I don't think Pago's going to do it. I really don't.
Really? You don't think Pago's going to electrify the forgotten?
For every penny we spend on old people, we need to screw the young by an equivalent amount. It's like, I don't think so. I don't think that's the winning formula. Maybe it's just me.
Yeah, you can't see that like in the, you go through history. It's like coming out of the Mandela and King, all great oratory. They're actually talking about some version of Pago and sensible budget priorities.
Exactly.
In the last couple of minutes, I want to talk about actually, in fact, I think Emmanuel Macron is sort of your depressing sort of microcosm of a, I mean, he's carrying the torch on this failed third way technocracy.
Yeah.
And so doesn't seem to be working out so well.
Well, I mean, again, he's quite good. He's quite a nimble pivoter as well. I mean, you got to give credit where credit's due. As a guy who's a former investment banker who basically looks good on camera, who funds a movement, which, if you think about it, shouldn't be logically possible because it's centrist populism, right? So he basically takes over the middle with nothing. A bunch of people join on that and figure out we don't really stand for anything. And then while they're struggling to get policies together, a whole bunch of people in rural France go, all right, we might be together with you in this whole climate change thing, but our wages haven't gone up in nearly a decade, and we're the ones that have to commute into the cities because you guys own everything, and we can't actually live there anymore, and you just put taxes up on us. Meanwhile, your billionaire friends still aren't paying taxes because you took away the wealth tax, so stuff you. And you can pretty much see how that one works out.
And so, were you as disturbed as I was? Speaking of that, in fact, because I do think that the Democratic Party, there are changing dynamics and some very positive momentum with some of the personalities that we've been alluding to. But it really was disturbing when you saw some people from, pretty prominent Democratic outlets and think tanks, basically, their only understanding of what was happening in France was, well, why would you support these protesters? They're opposed to action on climate change, which is the whole right. Like, I think the right-wing propaganda effort to discredit the science, I mean, whatever, that's nonsense. But the right-wing effort to say, look, dealing with climate change is a big Bloombergian vision to make your life even cramped and worse while the people fly around in jets and pay carbon offsets. That's actually very dangerous for a broad climate.
I totally agree. I mean, the notion of climate equity, climate justice internationally as well as domestically. And we've thought a lot about this. We don't do anything about it, but how do you compensate poorer nations, etc. And it really has to be, and this is something that is in the Green New Deal, which I think wouldn't have been there a year ago or 2 years ago, had been written earlier, is, this massively affects communities in different ways. And the poorer and more vulnerable communities to both the climate change exposure, the socioeconomic inequality, need to be compensated for the fact that they're going to take a hit to an already threadbare life. Right. And that's absolutely fair, and we should be completely honest about saying that. And what Macron did, he did this all a service by showing how tone-deaf upper middle-class technocracy is to those issues.
In the last couple of minutes we have, I mean, could you give us a hint of, would decarbonizing the economy, would your argument be that this is the sort of the next time we have an economic crisis, or even before that, hopefully, that instead of this kind of central organizing myth of returning to austerity, we need to have a central organizing sort of story of kind of like ecologizing our global politics?
Well, here's the thing. I've never been a great fan of global politics. It's hard enough to get the neighborhood to agree with each other, let alone express solidarity, for the other side of the planet.
Right.
And we do seem to be in a nationalist moment, which is precisely because people feel that, rightly or wrongly, the notion of globalism has basically given short shrift to local interests and disadvantaged local interests. And, and they're not wrong on that. And the nice thing about nations, there is at least a possibility of control, hence the great British phrase and Brexit of take back control. We'll see how plausible that is. They're doing a big, strange experiment on that one. But I think that, as much as we can have slogans, as much as we can have efforts, I think we really need to be just cognizant of the fact that what's coming is real, right? That there's no way that we talk our way out of this one. I saw a bumper sticker years ago that stuck with me. It just said, "Nature bats last." Right? And it's coming. Now, here's the deal. I think this is a positive way to think about it. All those charlatans in Silicon Valley that have been hawking bits of the sky to each other, investors and unicorns and all the rest of it for the past 10 years. Oh, we're changing everything. No, you're just getting rich on schemes, really. Now, those guys that are going to solve all of our climate change problems, well, maybe they are. But at the end of the day, what's going to happen first is something like Miami is going to run out of drinking water. And when that happens, we will collectively crap our pants. And we'll have to remove a major city or something like this. And it won't be like Katrina, where it's like, well, it's poor people, we don't care. It'll be prime real estate. And at that point, all notions that, we're going to have a shortage of work and tech will change everything. No, we're going to have millions of people building seawalls.
Right.
That's how this stuff's going to get done. Because at the end of the day, the only way you adapt to your own planet basically trying to eliminate you is with a massive amount of labor. So there's plenty of work to be done. Not all of it is intellectual.
Professor Mark Blyth, I appreciate your time as always, getting you in right under the gun. I hope we can do it again soon. And one day we will scheme, in spite of you being 50, to get you to Brooklyn. We'll make it happen.
I can't. I will. Seriously, the hipster quotient will just bounce out the minute I walk in the room. I can't do
it. Thank you, Professor Blyth. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you. All right, folks. I like that guy. Although I have to say, I mean, Richard Wolf's in his 60s. He comes in studio. I'm like trying to Jewish mom guests. It's like, I don't know, just be nice. We have a nice time in studio. Everybody seems to enjoy themselves. I don't know. Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. We got two pieces of business before we get to this Kamala Harris thing, man. There's a lot to get to with this. I've been, a couple of weeks ago, I outlined, I think, a very sound strategic approach for approaching a Kamala Harris candidacy in our moment and with a left perspective. And the ironic thing is that a couple of weeks into her being out campaigning, I like her, but for all of the wrong reasons. Part of me really profoundly likes and appreciates highly cynical personalities with certain kind of savvy and ability to just jettison. So maybe I'm not speaking well. Maybe I'm not.
You would really fuck up a focus group, man.
I would so fuck up a focus group because I would be the one guy just be like, you know that really inauthentic thing there? I liked how she did that. But you know what? That's the thing. Actually, all focus groups are fucked up. I was talking about that with somebody because it's there's research on it because focus groups have become so publicized in a way. These people go into the room with their sense of what they should say about things. So they'll be the suburban moms, education is really important in our house. And the guy's like, well, I'll tell you what, I think, got national security. And it's they're actually playing their archetypes to the focus group. I will say, and I can't go into details, but in the brief, highly ethically dubious career that I was part of with, manipulating public opinion, I'll just say, watching people be on the other side of a focus group, like the people monitoring it on the other side of the room, and watching how dismissive they are of like absolutely valid concerns is pretty disgusting.
No, it's like Liza Featherstone has a book about focus groups.
We should have her on.
Yeah, that'd be really fun to talk to her about.
But would you put us or?
You can see
if you want to see a good.
That's a good topic for us.
Yeah, no, that'd be fun because I know in her book it's interesting though. Just they one of the big things about focus groups is that the brands that get the consulting with different focus groups, they always dismiss the evidence that attacks like their product because they feel like, well, I've worked on this. And two, people really hate focus groups because they rightfully recognize that most people don't have a lot of power in the society. So the idea of going into like this like small room, which is a very fake, sterile place to like make decisions about like economics and politics, they realize that it's a sham.
And it's a synergy too, because when you go into some of the literature on China, like when some of like the reformers in the PRC, when they talk about like we're developing democratic models, what they actually mean is they essentially want to have like a reciprocal relationship between really tightly controlled focus groups and centralized delivery. But because they've been this brand model's corrupted everybody so much, they're like, yeah, that is it. Like these groups aren't controlled. You could say what your problem is. Yeah.
There's some good focus group content in the Killer Mike TV show. I don't know if you've got to that.
I haven't
episode.
got to that. I just saw the first episode of that show. I love that show, and we totally should. We do have to figure out how to get him on this show. He is like the quintessential TMBS guest, basically.
They focus group Crip and Blood Colas, and there's some very funny reactions. And Killer Mike calls the guy racist, and it's really really funny.
Oh, I gotta watch it. The first episode was great. I have to. Yeah, I want to see that. All right. But first, we have a couple of pieces of business to get to, and the first piece of business is a segment that actually gives Richard Wolff life. We'll set him up next time so you can go up there. I like the new graphic for you, your little
we have the
70s
graphic
style educational graphic. I like it.
But yeah, by the way, I really want to give the artist credit. I wrote it down in my notebook, and I don't have my notebook anymore, so I want to be able to shout you out, friend. So please reach out to me.
I'm going to look it up here.
Yeah. Sorry, 1 second. So I just want to talk about a couple quick things. The New York City Council is considering a new rule that would require fast food employers to provide just cause for firing workers. And this is interesting because typically that's something that you would get from a union contract. And it's certainly important to have, especially for workers in general, but especially for women and people of color, and especially in an industry like fast food. And I believe that New York City would be the first city to guarantee that kind of protection for workers. This is something that's like really significant when you realize that union membership in this country is still on the decline. From 2017 to 2018, it went down from 10.7% to 10.5%. And it definitely has a major effect on wages. Just last year, the difference between union workers and non-union workers was 82% of non-union workers were making 82% of what union workers were making. So that's average weekly wages for non-union workers was $820 a week, while for union employees was $1,000.51. And this is important because we're still talking about the recovery from the recession, and wage growth is still not happening. It's happening so slowly that it's basically being gobbled up by increases in cost of living. And we saw how the shutdown really showed how fragile most Americans are financially. And while we're seeing low unemployment numbers at 4%, we're really missing out on the grander narrative of what those unemployment numbers mean. So you think with low unemployment that wages would be going up, but there's a lot of other factors that are keeping them down. Specifically, we're looking at a lot of workers who are having to work part-time work out of economic necessity. Just last January alone, 500,000 workers entered the labor market and picked up part-time jobs out of economic necessity, basically unable to afford their life. They needed to get part-time work. 1.6 million workers are marginally attached to the labor force, and the unemployment rate is probably underestimating the full potential of the economy. If you look at numbers before the recession, we're still seeing prime age workers, and those are workers who are 25 to 54. The ratio of those workers who are employed now is still lower than it was in pre-recession times. So basically, a lot of people don't get picked up. So around like 70% of workers who are getting new jobs weren't people who would have been counted as unemployed just the month before. So there's tremendous slack in the labor market. And it's important to recognize that, because that means that there's a lot of people who are basically willing to take low-wage jobs, and there's a larger reserve pool of labor, which basically is competing against you for work, and that drives wages low. So when we're talking about workers in the fast food industry, it's not necessarily getting fired, but the threat of being able to be fired over trivial matters that really drives wages down. And just, there's 3 important points about the wage growth in the United States. Specifically, the wage growth has been so slow. The EPI, the Economic Policy Institute, says that wage growth should be growing around 3.5 to 4% for workers to even be able to recognize or have a significant impact on their life from wage growth. And we haven't been getting that through the recession, not even close. So not only are we not hitting the target today, but because wages have not been growing at a healthy rate for the past decade, basically, even if we do get that growth, it will have to go on for a long, sustained period of time to be able to make up for the losses that we've seen. And specifically, you see what happens when wages are low. The labor share of corporate profits has dropped from pre-recession levels, which was 83.7% of corporate profit, to now just 76%. So it's significant that there's a lot of money basically in corporate profit that is just going to the people who are already incredibly wealthy. And what happens when people don't have money? Debt increases. From 2009 to today, the student loan debt for households has increased nearly $1 trillion. In 2009, it was 0.66.
I've contributed to that.
I definitely helped out with those numbers.
There's a lot of contributions to that effort in this room.
But in 2009, it was 0.66 trillion in student debt, and at the end of 2018, it was 1.44 trillion. Credit card debt has returned to its pre-recession levels, and this is very significant. One of the biggest areas of growth in household debt since the recession has been in auto loans. In 2009, $0.77 trillion in household debt was in auto loans, and today it is $1.27 trillion. And the New York Fed just released a report that showed that there's a record 7 million Americans that are 90-plus days behind on their auto loans.
Yeah.
And that's a very frightening statistic because it shows that the health of the economy is not as good as some people would like to be arguing. And it's important to recognize this, that there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So we should be encouraged by the labor mobilization that we've been seeing with teachers and low-wage workers across the country. We need to recognize that we're not going to be saved by our bosses, and we're not going to be saved by billionaires. We're going to be saved through mobilization. It's going to be a long fight, and we need to continue to draw inspiration from each other.
Absolutely. Do we have up on screen who did that?
It's J. Andrew World.
Oh, comrade J. Andrew World.
At right about now 2. Number 2.
This is he's really talented. He's the guy who did all the portraits of us too.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, it's a talented guy.
Check
Thank you,
Andrew World.
Thank you, Andrew.
He has a YouTube channel we should put in the show notes too, where he does his drawings.
Oh, great.
Check it
out. Friend of show, very talented guy. All right, I just want to touch on this just for a couple of minutes, and then we'll get to this clip. The war on Yemen is continuing, and there was a lot of interest a couple of months ago. There was a lot of attention. The Ro Khanna motion in the House, the Bernie Sanders, Chris Murphy, Mike Lee effort in the Senate. Now, and all they're trying to do is cut off U.S. funding for this war. And again, this war goes back to 2015, when essentially the Obama administration literally is a sop to the Saudis. The Gulf states were having meltdowns and conniptions and freaking out and sloshing all sorts of money, along, of course, with the Israel lobby across D.C. because of the Iran deal. The most successful piece of diplomacy in our modern world until... Actually, Trump hasn't quite fully destroyed it. He's just severely undermined it. But the Europeans, the Iranians, the Chinese, Russians are still working to keep this thing going because it's, in fact, been quite successful. So The war in Yemen started, the war which was perceived by the Saudis as a proxy war with Iran. They thought the Houthis, they talked about Hezbollahization. Even though the Houthis were actually an organic, or to use I can't help myself, they were endogenous. They were a group that worked from a base in Yemen and had their own roots in Shia politics. And by the way, I always like to stipulate in these conversations, not our politics. I mean, this is right-wing religious politics, essentially. But they have very legitimate grievances and invalid political concerns, and they would be part of any kind of equitable broad settlement in Yemen. And since 2015, the Yemenis and the Emiratis have unleashed one of the most brutal mass-killing campaigns that is happening in the world today. There's been cholera epidemics, food shortages, children are starving to death, hospitals and funeral homes are being bombed, and since Trump got into office, just like with drone strikes, just like with all these other areas where there already was a obscene policy in place, the small checks on what is just sort of unregulated mass slaughter have been totally removed. And the Trump administration, as of a couple of days ago, is objecting to measures to end U.S. support for the Saudis in the Yemen war, according to a headline in Reuters. The Trump administration threatened Monday to veto an effort in the U.S. Congress to end U.S. military support for a Saudi-led coalition war in Yemen, continuing a standoff with lawmakers over policy in the kingdom. And it goes on, basically, the sort of Trump spin is that the measure is inappropriate because they're providing refueling and support services, not troops. So this is a ridiculous, I mean, I'm annoyed by pedantic arguments in general, but this is the sort of purist sociopathic expression of that. And we already know, I mean, we know the base of the relationship in general on oil and arms deals. And we know that Trump is even more naked and even more venal, along with Mike Pompeo, than even people in U.S. Congress who are terrible, who are awful. The mutilation and murder of Jamal Khashoggi even managed to offend as pitiful a creature as Lindsey Graham. So this is something that we're going to need to keep putting a lot of energy on, and the stakes are, and the battle lines are really clear. I mean, it's the Trump administration, it's Republicans who back it. There were 5 Democrats in the House, the bloodbath, murderous 5 Democrats who voted to undermine this legislation several weeks ago. And then there are basically just Raytheon and other precision-guided missile systems and weapons manufacturers. This is a raw conflict in that regard. So we'll stay on it. All right. Kamala Harris is definitely, of people running for president, she has the most political skill in a kind of traditional sense of, you know, has some charisma. I mean, this is not like, we're not talking like Barack Obama or Bill Clinton, but I would say of anybody running right now, she has, or certainly AOC, of anybody running right now, she's got the most chops, I would say. And, you know, we'll see. I'm actually not as, I think she'll be in the final 4, but I'm not sure that this campaign is going to take off in the way that some people want it to or think it will. And I'm all about people evolving in their policy positions. And I don't really care about nitpicking about people's hypocrisy. But this clip on The Breakfast Club about weed, I mean, it would be funny in and of itself because it's just hacky comedically. But there is actually some substantive things here that we're going to need to touch on for a minute. But she was on The Breakfast Club. We will not play the full video because The Breakfast Club, like so many others on YouTube, are pathetic with copyright strikes and sad. But we'll play the clip, the audio. And this is her talking about weed.
Also, and I know the answer to this too, they say you oppose legalizing weed.
That's not true.
I know.
and look, I joke about it, half joking. Half my family's from Jamaica. Are you kidding me?
They be so mad at you. Have you ever smoked?
I have.
Okay. Like in
And
college,
I inhaled. I did
You
inhale.
did inhale? Okay.
It was a long time ago. But yes.
I know you have to go. They say you have to go. I just wanted to
I
ask.
just broke loose.
I mean, was it in college? See, I like stuff like that. That's a real honest answer.
Real.
Was it a blunt or joint?
It was a joint.
Hey.
Yeah.
You remember the high?
I do.
So if it was legalized all throughout the country and medicinal, would you do it?
Listen,
again?
I think that it gives a lot of people joy, and we need more joy.
We need more joy in this world.
So I just want to place that in relationship with also quoting like Three Little Birds and Bob Marley lyrics. I'm quoting briefly from the Jackman. She opted to not join states in attempt to take marijuana off of the DEA's list of most dangerous substances. When Obama raided California's medical marijuana dispensaries, Harris put out an empty statement. When asked about legalizing recreational marijuana in 2012, only a week after the New York Times endorsed national legalization and less than a year before she started warning about the failure of drugs, Harris laughed. As with the case with respect to the three strikes law, in 2014, her Republican opponent ran to her left on the issues. Now, look, again, this is not just like minding somebody's hypocrisy. This is a policy that has destroyed so many people's lives for doing exactly what you're expressing there, which is engaging in a harmless pastime that gives people joy. And if you put this in relationship with so many other areas where she has the right discourse, and I have no doubt that she understands the issues. This is obviously somebody who no one's ever going to pull a defense of Kamala Harris off that like she didn't know about something or she didn't have a nuanced understanding. Not for a second. But there's a raw political calculation to oppose Supreme Court measures getting rid of excess prison labor. Now she's reversing herself on it. But at the time, the defense in court did literally include, and this is not just internet rumor mongering, it said, we have a labor population here. We can't get rid of it. That's in the argument. Then we also have defending three strikes laws. Three strikes laws in California have people serving 25 to life sentences for shoplifting. Then you have the child truancy. And then you have not even being up to par with the Obama administration on weed. And now we're coming out going like, Charlemagne, my family, Irie. What? Like, we'll joke about it in a second. And there's also some important investigative digging on what rap records she was listening to when she was sharing this joy at college. But that is a problem on like an actual substantive leadership level. And I keep saying this about so many things. I am totally done with one-dimensional cancel culture bullshit across every board you can imagine. If Kamala Harris came out and said, I was wrong on the policy, I see that clearly, she could even actually go into those jokes. She could say, yeah, it actually felt a little ridiculous enforcing things I knew were wrong when, half of my family's Jamaican. Now, my understanding of Jamaica is not necessarily that every like middle-class Jamaican person is running around going like, legalize a herb from a tree. So I think that's a bit hacky, and I'm not sure if that actually reflects broad-based Jamaican attitudes. But the fact that we're going from ruthless drug warrior, ultra-right prosecutor, not even a moderate one, arguably, in many of these issues, then we're going to legalize weed, like the way Obama used to do it. Obama had this same, question from the pothead gallery. And then we're going to, without missing a beat, come on, of course. Weed's awesome.
I mean,
it speaks to something deeper than standard issue political bullshit.
And that's what's so frustrating about it, because it's like, if she were to come out and say, you know what, I've evolved on this issue and I recognize how much damage it's been. But since she's been, pushing her run for president, it's been, I've always been down. I've always been cool
Right.
about marijuana. And you know what? Unlike a lot of other politicians who are just sort of like, oh yeah, was never really up for a vote or anything like that, you were actually in a position
It was
to
up
make
for
a
put
difference.
people in prison,
Yeah.
and ruin their lives.
Exactly. And, you know, to act like, oh, yeah, this is like how I've always felt. And I've always understood the inequities in the criminal justice system. I've always thought it was silly.
Which again, I think she did.
Yeah.
Which adds another layer to it.
That's probably, that might make it even worse. I mean, definitely
Right.
makes it even worse.
Right.
And then to add, you know, that like, oh, yeah, and we just need more joy in the world. And that's why we need, think about all the joy that was robbed of all these people who were put into prison for nonsense, for something that you're laughing about now. I mean, it's sick.
It's sick.
And people are still in prison for this. And that's the thing that's really, really frustrates me so much about the shift on marijuana, right? People who've had their lives ruined for going to prison, right? And now, like, oh, there's a big political shift. And we still let people, you know.
Yeah, where's the
run.
call for broad amnesty
Exactly.
and commuting of sentences? That's another thing. You could tack the policy shift with, and that's why I'm saying we need to get people out
We
of
need to
jail.
make it
people
right.
are still serving these sentences. They're still having their credit scores affected. They still have assets that were seized. I mean, a whole bunch of things that we need to get on now. You know, she's half Jamaican and half Indian. Do you think she was suggesting that the Indian part of her personality was pro-criminalization?
I don't
She had
know.
like an internal war. Like the Jamaican part was like, "Irie from the tree," and then the Indian part was like, "No, you must have order, or you will go to prison." Yeah, I don't know. I mean, we're seeing it. We'll get to with the post game, but like Amy Klobuchar, she came out and she said, "I was unbelievably abusive, and I apologize, and I've worked on it." I would say, great. I don't have anything to add to that. If you come out and say,
where are you on the Green New Deal?
Where are you on the? Literally would be my follow-up question. If your response to, "I terrorize people who used to work for me," is, "I want to bring that same spirit to leading the country," I would say, "What the fuck is wrong with you?" Which is literally what she said. She actually basically has come out and been like, "Oh no. I expect great. I want to throw binders at this country.
Yeah.
I want to emotionally terrorize people that didn't sign up to my stupid tax credit scheme with Ben Sass."
The 21st century is going to be great because instead of Henry Kissinger, it's Henrietta Kissinger.
Right. That's it. That's the mentality.
Yeah, I mean that's the thing about liberals that could be very frustrating. It's like, you know, if you come into the highest office, right, and you are the president, there's a lot of really miserable stuff that the United States government does, and it is sort of, you know, unreasonable to expect one president to come in and be able to dismantle everything, right?
Of course.
But when we start talking about, you know, character and what people are doing in certain positions of power, if they don't recognize like the moral weight of their decisions, if they just think, well, nobody's going to notice what I'm doing, and then later I can just, you know, deny it or say, oh, that's what was, you know, popular at the time. That's very serious because, you know, a lot of the stuff like you talk about, like a lot of the U.S. torture that was going on, we don't find out about that until years later, right? That's something that comes out afterwards. And not having somebody who's able to make those kind of moral decisions is something that, you know, is very worrying. And yeah.
Well, and I also just think, and I will say, I mean, that is part of like this ludicrous double standard with Bernie Sanders, which is like, you're going to go and nitpick. I mean, because again, like, look, he voted for the 94 crime bill. That's a mistaken vote. But let's be real. If he voted against that, the only thing that would come out of that for the same people that are criticizing him would be he voted against the Violence Against Women Act, which is part of that bill. That would be the only thing that would come out of it, not he saw ahead of the curve on the prison industrial complex before it was trendy. And, you know, and then there's all this other footage of like, yeah, he endorsed Jesse Jackson for president. Like, yeah, I think that was a pretty good call, sorry to say. And certainly the call I would have made. And so you can bind this like, well, when you're talking about somebody who literally put people in prison for like lengthy sentences for smoking a joint, that you can't be critical about or assess. But, you know, certainly somebody who basically has a pretty solid track record across a range of issues, you can nitpick and find like the smallest, because, you know, in the words of one tweet that I should have screenshotted by a very woke Twitter account, and I don't even think it exists anymore. It was like a 2016 one or 2015, but they said Bernie reminded them of a landlord, which I did like. Just like, oh, it's very woke. Yeah.
Wait, I thought he was like the bad roommate. That was a different Twitter?
Oh, no, that was Joy Reid. Joy Reid would never upgrade him to landlord status, which tells you different renting situations. I think the other person might have been a little bit more on the ground because they still had like some annoying old Jewish guy being like, you late with the utilities. Joy Reid sends it through a broker and she's fine. So she's just like going back to college. Joy Reid was like, you remember that Jew that would show up and just like put Doobie Brother posters on the wall? So lame. I don't really go in that much on Joy, but Joy Reid kind of had her own, like she's been doing her own like precursor, like she's been doing a little bit of that routine, right? Like I never had any problem with gay people. It was Russian hackers. You fucking
that
kidding
is
me?
The best.
That was
I thought those blog posts were down.
I totally respected the hustle on that. I'm bad for focus groups.
I know, man.
When I
Mess
saw
them up.
Joy Reid was said it was Russian hackers, I was literally like 80s movie, like.
See, that's why I'm surprised that you're not like a third party voter, because I feel like you'd be the guy who would just vote for like the most ridiculous character every once in a while just to fuck with people.
Maybe for local rate, but they don't provide it. The only way that Jill Stein is cool is if she actually is a Russian operative. Like if she actually has points from Gazprom to undermine the election, then I like her. But if she's actually just like, vote for peace, I'm not with it.
Because so only if you can create havoc and confusion.
No, it's just that third party, and I know this always makes people, a certain contingent of people, really freak out. But honestly, it's like that impulse to be like, we should step out of all of this, and it's two capitalist parties, and it's fundamentally rotted and corrupt. It's like, yeah, right. And you think that that's going to be addressed through like a personal moral expression in a small general election vote? Like if that's really your mentality, then you have to get into politics outside of electoral politics, in my opinion. And people that I know who are like street activists who either didn't vote or voted for her, I have nothing to say to. Because to me, it's like you've earned your stripes to make that mistake, in my opinion. But I'm also like over. I said my piece. I'm also. It's so hard because then on the other hand, there's the I can't believe I voted for Jill Stein and the Republic and democracy and Jill Stein, and it's just like, all right, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Like especially, I think at this point, people who are voting for Green Party candidate at this point and not seeing, like, if you're voting for Green Party candidate in Pennsylvania and you don't understand the actual differences between those two main candidates and how this stuff plays out, I don't think that that's a persuadable voter. Like, I think you've actually probably...
That's what is the I was told by AppleCare lady.
Yeah. Same.
Like when they say, like, when people talk about how the DNC like promised to be neutral or something like that, it's like, yeah, I mean, this isn't the world we live in.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
Make as much hay from that as you think you can, but I don't think it's going to lead to much.
Yeah, cue Kamala Harris laugh.
Yeah. I guess like for me, it's just like having been a cynical, like, I don't know, I'm pretty
Charlemagne.
I'm pretty active politically, but I've always just been like, it's going to be very unlikely that I'm be able to vote for anybody who I like ever for most of my political life.
Right.
And now when I have the opportunity, I'm very excited, right?
Of
I
course.
get to vote for AOC or Byrne or something like that.
Totally.
Like for me, it's like, wow, this is very exciting.
Yeah, but you're right. You should see, it was like, you never should, voting is purely harm minimization, and then you go out and you try to, through whether it's activism or whatever means you have, to try to recreate the climate you're in. And that was it. That was always my understanding.
Yeah, I mean, my experience was coming from North Dakota, where you there's never a Democrat there's never a politician you're excited to vote for. You're just going to vote against the asshole.
Right.
And then here it's like primaries are actually way more fun to vote in than the generals. It's like you actually get to vote for like occasionally some cool people.
Of course, mid-Jamaican. All right, folks, we're going to go to the post game where we have a gulag segment, which I've already teased. We have a whole bunch of sound to get to. We're going to break down the Ilan situation. So if you want to watch that, become a patron and just join us for everything we do as we grow and expand. We appreciate all of you. This past illicit history on Howard Schultz, The Third Way in the 1990s, is unlocked. This Sunday, we're doing one on the Michael Manley moment in the 1970s and the global supply chain, which will relate back to our kind of previous histories on the CIA in Jamaica in the 70s and also the shower posse. So I know there's a lot of new patrons. Get back into the archives. Check it out. Patreon.com/TMBS. Spread the word. Thank you to Matt. Thank you to David. Thank you, David. Thank you, Forrest. Thank you each and every one of you. We'll see you in the postgame.